In today's lecture, like I said, we're going to, of course, cover a two-part lecture series, which I'll first start talking about the scientific revolution, of course, that started way back around Copernicus' time in the 16th century, and then I'll also go up through, of course, the Age of Enlightenment, which really we're talking mostly about the Age of Enlightenment, which a lot of this is kind of put together usually as one kind of era, but I'll talk about that and how that affects Europe and I guess later affects the world. Kind of start talking a little bit about, I'll kind of go through the background of the Age of Enlightenment first. I'll kind of get to that because that's one of our main topics I'll talk about today. And of course, I'll spend a little time talking about the early stages of the scientific revolution that starts in the 16th century. But yeah, the Enlightenment was a period in mostly European history that kind of starts back in the, really starts in the, well, it really starts in the 1600s is about when they think it got started. But usually the peak of the Age of Enlightenment, also called Age of Reason, is around the 18th century. So usually late 1600s is about when it starts. It goes up to like the early 1800s, like the time of maybe around Napoleon when he's living. Before the Romanticism movement kind of comes in, of course, in the 19th century. They call it different names. Of course, reason is one of the main names that they often call it because that was one of the main themes, of the Age of Enlightenment. But the French were the ones that started calling it Enlightenment because they often called it the Century of Lights. And so hence the name Enlightenment was used later. And primarily you can see here from this slide here that basically the Enlightenment was primarily an intellectual type philosophical movement that were centered around, the ideas of reason. It favored ideas like making reforms and progress to, society at the time. And so that's the reason why it was often called that, of course, later. The Enlightenment was very important. You have to understand they advanced a lot of new ideas that that are kind of around today. Of course, we've heard of like things like the idea of liberty, progress, toleration towards others, fraternity, like being brotherhood of mankind, and things like that. Ideas of constitutional government, something it popularized. Separation of church and state. You start seeing more secular studies of things in society. Liberalism is kind of born about that time as well. These other things, like political change is one of the big things, of course, that came out of the whole Enlightenment. The ideas of democracy, self-government, are things that kind of become more popular, increase civil liberties, especially for people like lower classes. And so the ideas of like the divine right theories like absolutism eventually get destroyed by the Age of Enlightenment, which is important later. But I'm going to first go ahead and talk about today. I'm going to talk about, of course, one thing that was a big influence, of course, on the Age of Enlightenment. You have the so-called scientific revolution that comes in right before that. The Enlightenment was heavily influenced by the scientific revolution. That really, I guess, peaks around the 16th to about the 18th centuries overall. And yeah, there's all kinds of famous scientists. We won't talk about all of them. We'll kind of get into some of the famous ones, of course. Those are the big ones, I guess, they talk about early on that were well known, like, of course, Isaac Newton up top right there, Copernicus on the bottom, Galileo on the bottom left, and then bottom right is Johann Kepler. I think those are probably the most four early on that were very popular. Rene Descartes, I probably should have thrown him in there too, but he was also pretty big as well. But of course, we're going to go ahead and first talk about Nicholas Copernicus. Copernicus really is the man that really started the whole Enlightenment. They consider him to be the father of modern astronomy. As you can see, he influenced other astronomers later, like Galileo and so on, Kepler, and Copernicus was the one that destroyed the whole Ptolemaic model or geocentric model of the solar system. The fact that everybody thought a long time ago that the planets all revolved around the Earth, including the sun as well. It was made popular by Claudius Ptolemy, who was a famous Greek philosopher, who was also like a geographer and astronomer. And he had this book called the Almagest. It was called, actually. That's the book that popularized it. But they do think that a lot of his theories were popularized by the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who lived before him. So some of these ideas kind of went back to like around the 4th century BC. So his idea was what we call the heliocentric or Copernican model, I guess what we call it now, today. And so he popularized this idea that the planets, revolve around a star, like in a solar system, that kind of deal. And this was something that, by the way, he developed without telescopes. He mostly used it with his own naked eyes, and a lot of early astronomers didn't really use telescopes until like Galileo and Kepler came along. But they used a lot of mathematics was used, because a lot of these early astronomers, a lot of them were mathematicians, if you know about that overall. He did have a book that was very popular, of course, you've heard of, which is called, you can see there, On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Bodies, which was published in 1543 after his death, which is interesting about that. You probably wonder why was it not published, when he was alive and all that. They do think there was a lot of controversy about his book that he published. I think he thought he would be criticized by the Catholic Church, maybe even accused of heresy, because the church didn't want to accept it, if you know about that. And so that was actually banned at one point by the Catholic Church until the 1800s. Copernicus also thought his ideas weren't exactly right, like his calculations were off or something like that. And so that's another reason why he didn't publish it either as well. In his work, by the way, I told you about on the revolutions of the heavenly bodies, he says that there's 6 planets that are out there: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. He talks about the fact that the moon is going around the Earth. But there's one thing that he was off on, which they proved to be wrong, of course, about that with Copernicus. He said that all the planets orbit in a perfect circle, like around the sun. That proved to be wrong. It's an elliptical orbit, as you know now. But something he kind of, influenced a lot of these ideas. And so he started the whole Copernican, revolution that followed and turned everybody on their head about how the universe really was. So you have Copernicus that you have. Here's kind of an image, by the way, of, showing the difference between, the Ptolemy's, model that he had and versus the one of Copernicus that he's got. But he says all the stars are motionless and revolve around the sun too, and things like that. But that's really not true. But he's close to it. He's more close than anybody else has been, I guess, before that. There's also this other man named Tycho Brahe, who was a Danish astronomer and mathematician. He was famous. He had kind of a rival system to Copernicus he came up with, which was called the Tychonic system, which was not quite the same, but it was kind of similar. And he did a lot of studies too on studying like stars and planets as well. Brahe at one point, by the way, was the official astronomer of the Holy Roman Empire during his lifetime. This is in the 16th century. And anyway, he was one of the last what they called naked eye astronomers, because he didn't really use a telescope at that point. But he had this book he published, which became real popular in the 16th century, called On the New Star, which studied a lot of different stars, like in the Milky Way. And it was actually one of the first books to describe what they call a supernova, which I guess is like a star that's kind of exploded, basically. And he had one that was called Tycho's supernova or something like that. They called it, basically. So it's a very, very popular book. Kepler, we'll get to a little bit later, worked under him. He was like kind of this, his protege, I guess, that kind of influenced him a lot. And so Brahe is kind of important, in early also astronomical type, research at the time overall. Now we also got another astronomer too Of course, here's by the way the Tychonic system, which his system is not exactly close to what it should be, but he's got the sun kind of in a different location of where it is. He's trying to explain why maybe the sun might be going around the Earth or whatever, but he's close to like more like the one that Copernicus has, but not quite. So it's kind of a strange one, his system he had. But then you've got Johann Kepler, who was German astronomer, who's well known. Kepler worked, like I said, under Tycho Brahe. And Kepler was very famous for being one of the first to use telescopes. He invented something called the Keplerian telescope. That's a type of telescope that used glass lenses. Later telescopes use mirrors, as you know. A lot of this may have come from like the battlefield where, generals would use, I guess, telescopes or whatever to look at the enemy, what's going on. And so I guess they started to use those in studying outer space, things like that. Kepler was, by the way, a master mathematician. At one point, he was the master mathematician of the Holy Roman Empire. That's a good job, I guess. But what Kepler's very famous for is his laws of planetary motion, where he talks about how he thinks the planets, move around the sun in general. And what he basically disproved about Copernicus was that the orbits of the planets were elliptical. They weren't like a perfect circle, like Copernicus had believed. And he also proved that through, I guess, telescopes and math and all that, that a lot of the orbits that go, around the sun, the orbit is a lot quicker when they're closer to the sun compared to, planets that are farther away, things like that. And so those are ideas that kind of, Kepler came up with that were, influential. And I think they say a lot of these ideas influenced later also Sir Isaac Newton when he was kind of developing a lot of his theories on gravity and the laws of motion, etc. Then you got Galileo, of course, who became kind of controversial around the 17th century. Galileo, of course, was an Italian astronomer, also a mathematician and scientist as well. Galileo is very famous for popularizing the idea of the heliocentric model, which I think at that point people weren't sure about it at that point, especially because the Catholic Church was trying to prevent people from knowing about it and all that. And what made him kind of an influence, and I guess also what kind of created a lot of controversy also with himself and the Catholic Church, was he published this work in 1632, which was called the Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. What it did was it compared the two systems at the time that were kind of people were talking about. They had the Ptolemaic geocentric model, which had been around for years. And then he had the heliocentric model that he also compared, which was the one Copernicus was trying to push at that point. And what got Galileo in hot water, he said that the one that it should be is the heliocentric. That was the one that was correct. The planet should go around the sun. And so the Catholic Church got really angry about this, if you know. In the 1630s, they accused him of heresy. And he was brought before a Roman Inquisition, and he was told to recant, like what he basically stated in his work. And I think there's a famous story where in front of, I think it must have been one of those Catholic cardinals, he said basically that, yet it moves. I think was what he muttered under his breath, saying that the earth still moves around the sun. But he was put under house arrest for the rest of his life until he died in 1642. So yeah, he was influential later. If you know about one thing about Galileo, he was one of the first major, astronomers to use like telescopes and all that. And he studied a lot of the planets and also the moon throughout our solar system and all that. He also studied inertia. He wanted to learn how bodies move, in the environment. And so he took like objects and either roll them down hills or drop them off buildings to see how they would accelerate in space. And of course, what he found out was that no matter the size of the object, the bodies tended to fall or accelerate same kind of speed. So they call it law of falling bodies and all that. And they think that Galileo, what he was doing was kind of demonstrating what is basically gravity, or gravity influences, I guess, with that. They really think that Galileo discovered gravity, but it wasn't really explained later until Isaac Newton came along, of course, in the 17th century. He is very famous for supposedly going to the top of the Tower of Pisa, Italy, supposedly dropping off objects from it. Though some people think that's apocrypha, that it never really happened, that kind of thing. So yeah, Galileo was very influential. I think more than the other ones, before, but definitely pretty influential. Then you have, of course, Sir Francis Bacon, another early scientist as well. That's kind of famous, more like a philosopher. He was, of course, an English philosopher that was well known for popularizing the scientific method. People kind of view him as the father of empiricism, or scientific theory. And originally they called it the Baconian method because back in that time, at least in the 17th century, people didn't call science. They called it natural philosophy. And so the term scientific method is really not used till later. So Baconian method was the original term they used for it. And his idea was to basically, study observation of nature, to discover, how things work or whatever. And so his idea was to involve research, constructing a hypothesis, using experiments, developing some kind of conclusion, and then eventually publishing your work. And so that became the method of how scientists would, go about doing their scientific work over time. So that is one thing that he did do that's popular. He was really more of a philosopher, not a scientist, but some people think he's kind of an influence on that. Oh, he's also famous, him and Michel de Montaigne in France. About this, popularized this new form of literary genre called essay writing. If you know about that. I think Montaigne had his essays, I think is famous, and then Bacon had a bunch of essays too, essays of truth or essays on religious meditations. And those are things that kind of popularized that form of genre, literary type writing. So yeah, he's very influential, Sir Francis Bacon. Also, we have another famous Frenchman that's well known. Of course, you may have heard of Rene Descartes. Of course, also known as Rene Descartes, which is his Latinized name. But yeah, he was a French philosopher and scientist. They think that heavily influenced not just the scientific revolution, but the Age of Enlightenment. He actually primarily lived in the Dutch Republic, which is true about that. He's often seen as this father of modern philosophy, like several that's like that. I think Immanuel Kant and a few others are kind of seen as like the fathers of modern philosophy, especially in Europe. And a lot of his ideas, emphasize things on reason, things like that. And he's very famous for two philosophical works he published, mostly around the 1630s and 1640s. Discourse on Method, which I think is more famous, and then Meditations on First Philosophy is, of course, the other work that he's very famous for. Yeah, Discourse on Method is the one where he makes that famous statement that you may have heard of, which is, I think, therefore I am. A lot of that was talking about, I think, well, a lot of it was like skepticism, I know, was one of the main themes on his philosophical work, Discourse on Method, but it has a lot to do with, like, supposedly the soul and the belief about whether God exists. And I think it was like what Descartes was talking about was like, because I exist, God exists, things like that idea or whatever. That's the Latin, of course, term you see there, cogito ergo sum, of course, is the Latin version of it also as well. He's also the father of analytical geometry as well, which had been around since the Greeks, and all that. And he's known for the Cartesian coordinate system that you may have heard of or used before, which you see in that picture right there. It's named after his Latin name. That's where it comes from. So he was a big influence on also, a lot of the Enlightenment later. But I'll talk about one more who was big as well. That really the one that is considered the greatest scientist, of course, of the Enlightenment, and that's, of course, Isaac Newton. Everybody's heard of Newton. I think Newton is still considered one of the top 5 scientists of all time. I think Newton and Einstein, I think, are considered like the 2 greatest that there ever was overall. Newton is considered to be the father of modern science. That and also especially physics, which he heavily influenced. He's also considered a father of modern calculus, along with Gottfried Leibniz of Germany. And he was known for a lot of his theories, of course, that were on like gravity and, of course, the laws of motion that we have heard of before. Newton went back to the mid 17th century. In his early life, Newton was born at Woolsthorpe, which is a little village in what is England. He was born actually during the time of the English Civil War. And he went to Cambridge University, Trinity College, and over time he taught there, eventually became the famous Lucasian professor of mathematics, which he was for over 30 years. It's a famous, prestigious chair position, which was held later. I think if you know about Stephen Hawking, you heard of him, of course, held, I think, over 30 years also as well. And of course, his biggest thing he developed, in the 1680s was his 3-book volume, which was the Principia, which is the short name for his master work that he produced, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. That work had a major influence on modern science, especially physics. It popularized a lot of his ideas on the laws of motion, as you know, 3 laws of motion, and also gravity or universal gravitation, which is an idea he, of course, developed from really studying other scientists in general. And as you know, the laws of motion are famous. The first one is obviously every object stays in motion unless it's changed by an external force. The second law of motion, of course, force equals mass times acceleration. The third law of motion, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So these are all, principles that you've heard of before, that Newton, of course, was famous for. And the only thing, though, is the story of gravity is kind of controversial, if you know about that. It's always associated with the story about the apple falling, not on his head, but falling to the ground. He saw an apple falling from a tree at his house, and they think that story's a made-up story of how he kind of came up with the idea of universal gravitation. He doesn't really say how it works. If you know about Newton and all that, which was kind of controversial, and other scientists kind of criticized him for it, but they think there is gravity, that kind of thing, and all that. He did study things like light, if you know about that. He used prisms and things like that to study what was composed in light, and he figured out that using a prism that you could separate light into at least 7 colors of the spectrum, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Most people didn't know that at the time. That was kind of a controversial idea as well, that he kind of proved that's famous. Newton also influenced one of the first reflecting telescopes to be built. They originally called it the Newtonian telescope, which he sold to King Charles II in 1668. And his telescopes got rid of lenses and they started using mirrors. They think that the Newtonian telescope influenced modern telescopes today. So he does do a lot of stuff with optics as well in light in a lot of his scientific theories. In fact, he had another work called Optics that came out in 1704, which published a lot of his theories on light and things like that. But it also had some of his ideas on calculus, which he and Gottfried Leibniz in Germany, of course, was known for as well. There are a few things that are controversial about Newton. Newton was known for being an alchemist. Most people don't know about that. belief or theory about him, but he did kind of experiment with early chemistry, with metals, and he was trying to supposedly find this thing called the philosopher's stone, which was supposed to make anything out of any kind of matter into gold, if you know about it. He was also an anti-Trinitarian. Most people don't know about that either. He didn't think that the Trinity was something that was real. He thought there was a God, like one God, but not in the Trinity and all that. But he was very religious. That's something that other scientists later, modern scientists, a lot of them aren't very religious or an atheist or something like that. But Newton was very religious. He had a lot of Bibles, and he would study the Bible. He thought there were clues in the Bible that would prove when end times was coming. And in fact, he came up with this theory that the end of the world would come in 2060. He actually believed that. And so he was a lot, more, religious than people thought, like some of these other scientists, I guess, that were around, later. But he's very influential. Like Newton overall was really one of the most influential of all the different scientists, compared to like Copernicus or Galileo, etc. Now I'm going to move on next. I'm going to, of course, talk about also today and get into the Age of Enlightenment. We need to get into that and talk about, some of the ideas that go into the Enlightenment and all that. The Enlightenment, the actual main people that are really involved in the Enlightenment are what they call the philosophers. The philosophers were like these intellectuals that were in the Enlightenment that mostly lived in and around the 18th century, that were heavily influenced by a lot of the science that was kind of going on before that, going back to Newton, Galileo, Copernicus, and all that. In fact, the term philosophe is a French word meaning philosopher. They really weren't philosophers, by the way, but it's kind of a term they start using in the 18th century. But most of them were French, but there were some that were like British and American. They were kind of influential that kind of lived at the same time. Like Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, like the Americans, Thomas Paine, David Hume in Britain, as example. John Locke, of course, we'll get to, which were very, very famous overall. So these are all kinds of figures that are really behind the Enlightenment that are really important that we'll kind of talk about. One of the first I'll get to later will be John Locke. He's really the one that we talk about usually first. But let me talk about some of the things they believed in that were kind of famous. You see from that slide right there, those are really some of the main ideas that the philosophers really believed in. The idea of reason, the idea of happiness, nature, progress, liberty. Those are things that a lot of the philosophers really believed in. Like the philosophers really believed that there were natural laws that were governing the universe, that it wasn't all based on like God's revelations or miracles, things like that. They also believed that the government should try to make people happy. That's why Jefferson talks about the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, of course, in the Declaration of Independence. Progress, the idea of progress, advancing society, to try to change society to the better, new technologies to change society. The idea of liberty, democracy, those kind of things were ideas that were also pretty big. One thing that's real controversial about a lot of these philosophers, a lot of them were what they call deists. A lot of them were. They rejected a lot of these ideas of like revelation and supernatural things that God was intervening in the universe on things like that. They thought there was a supreme God that did exist, that had created the universe, but didn't really dictate and control the universe. Kind of like winds up like a clock and then lets it go, that kind of thing. And deism was kind of a non-Christian or even sometimes considered like an anti-Christian type religion that a lot of people believed in. And later they tried to stamp it out. A lot of different religions like Protestantism, and I think the Catholic Church tried to stamp it out later, as you know. But the deists see God as this great clockmaker, if you want to call it that, basically, that governs, all the natural laws, but kind of lets it go, like winds it up and everything kind of just goes because of laws. that are in the universe. These are very famous people that were considered deists, like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Voltaire, Adam Smith. You can see Thomas Paine, James Madison, Maximilian Robespierre. You may have heard of him. They were all considered men that were kind of deists at one point. So I'm going to talk about some of these different intellectuals that were real famous in the Enlightenment. I'm going to first go ahead and talk about first today, which is John Locke. We need to, of course, get into him because a lot of people consider him to be one of the first who were influential, of course, in the Enlightenment. Locke was considered to be the father of what we call liberalism. I don't know if you know that or not, but he is. And a lot of his theories, of course, were influential in the so-called social contract, which influenced a lot of people later, especially like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, if you know that. And Locke believed heavily in this idea that the government should be there. It's a social contract between the citizens and their natural rights in the monarch. He thought that the government should be there to protect people's natural rights, which are life, liberty, and property. That if they don't, they have a right to be removed from power and put in a new government that will, protect people's rights in general. And we've talked about it before, but remember we talked about Locke's famous essays. He wrote 2 treatises on government that came out right after the Glorious Revolution when King James II was, remember, ousted in that coup. And that particular set of essays, heavily influenced the Bill of Rights, which came out in 1689, that led to Britain adopting a constitutional monarchy. Declaration of Independence, of course, that heavily influenced Thomas Jefferson to write that. They do think it also influenced the United States Constitution as well. I think also the French constitutions that were developed later, after the French Revolution, also got started as well. Locke also came up with this idea of something called tabula rasa, the idea that everybody's born with a clean slate. That went away from the whole predestination ideas that were sometimes popular in Protestantism. So he kind of developed those kind of famous as well. But John Locke was heavily influential, especially with American government, things like that. There's also this man, too, you may have heard of course, which is Voltaire. We'll, of course, get to him as well. Voltaire is considered to be one of the biggest figures in the Enlightenment. In fact, the central figure that everybody usually talks about the most. Voltaire is a pen name. His real name was Francois Marie Aure, born late 17th century. You can see he was actually from like the upper middle class, raised by Jesuits, pretty much educated by Jesuits in like Catholic schools, which, by the way, he later resented and hated the Catholics. He's very anti-Catholic, Voltaire. And Voltaire was very famous for fighting against oppression. He was this man of the people that was there to fight for people against bigotry, injustices against people, inequalities, religious persecution. He favored a lot of the lower classes. I think Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau were considered the main champions of the French people later, especially with the influence on the French Revolution that came a little later in the 18th century. And Voltaire was actually a lawyer. I don't know if you know by trade, but he was also, like a writer, as you know. And but he often would use a lot of his, power as a lawyer to help people, like pro bono and things like that, help people in cases and get them out of trouble and so on. He got the pen name Voltaire. By the way, he was in prison like at least a couple times, like in the Bastille, Paris, France, under the Bourbon regime. And I think the first time he was in prison in his earlier life, he came up with the idea of Voltaire, which was actually an anagram of his Latinized name. He took his Latinized name, Aravet Lee, you see there on the bottom there, and kind of arranged the letters, and it became Voltaire. And so that became his name that he was, of course, used. Of course, we'll talk about the Bastille later. It's very famous for imprisoning a lot of people that are against the Bourbon regime. It was considered kind of a symbol of the tyranny of the Bourbon absolute government that they had, of course, at the time. I guess under Louis XV and later Louis XVI. Voltaire, by the way, was famous for a quote he would sometimes write in a lot of his letters, especially at the end of his letters, which was the quote, "Écrasez l'infâme," which means in French, crush the infamous thing, which the full quote is usually, whatever you do, crush the infamous thing and love those who love you. Kind of a debate about what the quote really meant, crush the infamous thing, but they think he's talking about like the Catholic Church and other institutions that are against his new ideas or reforms that he wants to do in society, and just love people that love the same thing that he does, not them, that kind of thing. He was famous, by the way, Voltaire, for being exiled. He was exiled numerous times. I think the first time he was exiled in the early, I want to say in the 1720s. And so he left and went to England, but he went to other countries, went to Germany, I think he went to Holland, lived in Switzerland for a while. He also visited Portugal, where they had a horrible earthquake, which he wrote about, which is famous. And he is known for also writing to a lot of famous monarchs. He wrote to Frederick the Great, who he formed a great friendship with. In fact, he lived with Voltaire. Voltaire lived with Frederick the Great for a while, and I think Frederick made him like his like a chamberlain or something under him or something like that. I think they quarreled. I know that, and I think there was even speculation they may have been lovers, because I think maybe they both may have been bisexual. I know he may have been bisexual. I think Voltaire has been talked about, I think, before. But he also wrote to Catherine the Great and other writers, other famous monarchs that were in Europe at the time. But he wrote to all kinds of people. One thing about Voltaire, he was a prolific writer. He wrote like over 20,000 letters to people, which is insane. Wrote over 2,000 works, pamphlets, poetry, novels, plays, historical works. I think at one point they say his whole volume was like something like 220 volumes of work that Voltaire produced at one point. So a very prolific writer, and also, like I said, a lawyer as well during his lifetime. He was known for those are probably his most famous works he was known for that are still around, talked about today. Oedipus was one of his first works he produced, which had his name Voltaire on it. And it was actually a reworking of Oedipus Rex of Sophocles, which came out in 1718. It was a very popular play when he produced it. So he produced a bunch of, I think close to like 50 plays or more at one point. There was also a series of essays he produced, which were called The Letters on the English, which were kind of controversial, which he published in 1734. These were actually a series of works, letters, essays that he wrote when he went to England after he was exiled first. And he went there and he realized the English had a better system of government. Their culture was better. So he wrote about that. And it was heavily criticized by the French government, banned afterwards. In fact, a lot of his works were banned, about that in parts of Europe. Later in his life, in 1759, he also published a famous satirical novel called Candide, you may have heard of, or maybe had to read before. And that's considered one of his most famous works now. But they say he wrote it because he wanted to make some money. That's what it was. I think it's mostly about skepticism. Candide, I think it's right. But no, it's about optimism, about optimism. Now, kind of talk about, he did come back in 1778, which is true about that. In right before that, King Louis XV had died, and Louis XVI came in. And so he returned to France at that point, and became very popular, of course, in the country, died right afterwards. But they had problems, if you know about this, when he died. Nobody wanted to bury him because he had insulted the Catholic Church and all that. And I think they finally found an abbey, I think, where he was buried in eventually later. But that's something that was kind of controversial about Voltaire and all that. Now they have also Denis Diderot, who was around about the same time as well in the 18th century. He was also French intellect, also as well. Diderot was primarily known for developing the French encyclopedia, usually spelled an E on the end instead. And he was a co-editor with this other man named Jean-Laurent de Lambert, who also was involved in the development of this vehicle. And what was the French encyclopedia? Well, it was this early version of like a general knowledge type dictionary about all knowledge, but it was primarily a type of vehicle that a lot of the philosophers used to publish their ideas. And the idea of an encyclopedia had been around. There was a man named Pierre Bayle who lived, I think, back in the 1600s. He had kind of developed early versions of like encyclopedias. I think his was more like a biographical one that he had. And that's kind of where it came from, the idea of it. But the people that were involved in publishing articles in it were called encyclopedists, is what they were dubbed. And it was a very secular work. It's part of why it was kind of controversial. Catholic Church didn't like it exactly. And there was actually attempts to have it banned multiple times throughout France in other countries. It was published between about the 1750s and 1770s. It actually had about 18,000 pages. That's how long the French encyclopedia was, in 17 volumes. They say the amount of words in it was over 20 million words, the actual whole encyclopedia. They do think it kind of, if you know about it, even though it was banned, it spawned other versions like the Encyclopedia Britannica, which came later, which the British developed. It basically was probably better, of course, obviously, but it spawned other versions that kind of came out of that because of what Denis Diderot did. A few other things about Denis Diderot I did want you to know about that are kind of famous. He was actually known for having a very close relationship with Catherine the Great. Back at one point in the 1770s, he went to Russia to visit her. And part of why he did this was because he was, I think he was like in bankrupt or something. He was going bankrupt and owed a lot of money. He was in debt, I know. And he was trying to save his library. He had a huge library of works that he had, which he later gave to her after his death. So he went to Russia to visit her, and she helped basically pay for his library to keep it and all of that. And he also was controversial for a bunch of books that he wrote that were kind of in his early career, before he started working with the French Encyclopedia. He was actually trying to try his hand at novels. If you know about, he was a novelist, believe it or not, Denis Diderot. In fact, he had these two novels that he wrote that were both banned by the French government. One was called The Skeptic's Walk, which was about atheism. Because I don't know if you know about Diderot, he was an atheist. So he wasn't like a deist or anything like that. He didn't believe in God at all, if you want to know about that. And his other novel he had was called The Discreet Jewels, which came out the next year in 1748. It's actually his erotic novel, which was very controversial. In fact, considered one of the first erotic novels ever written. It was about this idea of a sultan living in the Congo, and it was supposed to be like Louis the 15th or something like that. But he had this, it was called Discreet Jewels because he had this, some kind of jewels he had. If he held it up to a woman, it would tell her all of her whole sexual history, like all the lovers she's had and things like that. And it was banned for years. So anyway, yeah, Diderot was known for that, but most people don't know about him being a novelist. All right. Also, they have another famous philosopher who's well known, of course, you may have heard of, which is Montesquieu. Montesquieu, of course, was mostly known for writing about government and history. He was also a lawyer and judge in France. He was from the upper class, which is a little different. Most philosophers were mostly from like the middle class. Montesquieu was famous for a book he published in 1748, which was banned, by the way, too, at one point, which was called The Spirit of the Laws. This particular book heavily influenced like ideas of government, especially in the United States, especially in France later after the Revolution. And Montesquieu was one of the first to advocate that governments that are, really good and successful should have three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. He also thought they should have a separation of powers between them, so they're not like encroaching on each other. These are ideas he went back and started studying, like Greek and Roman history. He studied also the current British government they had, of course, in United Kingdom and all that. And so his idea was the fact that he thought that these different branches of government should also check each other's power. So he's got this idea of a checks and balance system. He kind of popularized that idea as well. And so that's ideas that go into a lot of other constitutions later. Like the United States, we have this idea of a veto, right? Where a president can veto legislation, passed by, say, Congress or whatever. They could, of course, override a veto. The idea of veto went back to the Roman times, of course, Roman Republic. Impeachment, of course, another idea where they can impeach a president, or maybe a recall, I guess would be like, for say, governors. Court overruling, say, Supreme Court would overrule like a certain law passed by Congress or whatever. That would be examples of forms of checks and balance systems, of course, that were there. Montesquieu also said that he thought there were three types of governments that were in existence worldwide, at least in the 18th century anyway. He said there were Republican, of course, governments, which I think at the time the Swiss had something like that. They had, and also later, I think Italy had something like that too, as well. Monarchical, like they have in France, and stuff like that. But he also had what they called despots or despotic type regimes, which were more absolute, I guess. I think monarchical is more like the British model, I think, more than anything. Despotic's more like absolute regimes like Russia, etc., where they're kind of absolute power and things like that. He coined that term, that third one, of course. And I guess despotic gave way to like dictatorships and things like that they have in modern times by the 20th century. But you can see that he's very influential, like on the United States. A lot of people view Montesquieu as this father or intellectual, ideological type father of the United States Constitution. He does influence our Constitution, and of course, like later France's type constitutions as well. Now, there's also Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau is also another famous figure in the Enlightenment as well that I need to talk about. Rousseau was actually not French. He was Swiss. He was born in Switzerland and eventually came to France, actually to originally become a composer. You want to be a musician, but he kind of was influenced by Denis Diderot to begin writing. In fact, he actually published some of his early works in the French encyclopedia. But most of his works were about political liberties or government, things like that. His most famous work is The Social Contract, which was published in 1762, which discusses a lot of ideas on how a community can create their own self-government, what they call the general will of the people, things like that. Rousseau rejected the idea that the king or a monarch could legislate or have divine right powers and things like that. He argued against that idea that, kings were all powerful and things like that. Although he wasn't really an advocate of Republican type governments like people think. I think maybe a lot of these fellows favored more of the British model than any of government. But they do think the social contract inspired a lot of political reforms later, like in France and Europe. It obviously sparked revolution, especially the French Revolution, because it was banned when it came out. I think in Switzerland, in some place, they even burned it, by the way, when it came out in general. And the social contract is very famous for a quote, especially at the beginning of it, you may have heard about, which is, "Man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains." And I think he even talks about this idea they should ban slavery too. Yeah, and kind of ahead of his time. But what he means by that quote is that he believes that mankind was born with certain rights that they had, natural rights or whatever, natural laws, I guess. But he can't because he's in chains due to these, I guess, despotic or absolute regimes that are preventing people from having these rights in general. So he was also, believe it or not, he had other works that were also popular as well. There's one called Julie or the New Heloise. It was a very popular romantic novel that he published in the 18th century, because he was kind of like a novelist, I think, before that a little bit. And it's a controversial novel because it's about these two lovers that write letters to each other back and forth. I think one was named Julie, and the other guy was I think his name was Saint Pro or something like that. And I think he had been like her tutor, but what happened was the two were from two different social classes. She was upper class, he was lower class. That was considered controversial. Those two, that story about that. It was actually, I think, they tried to ban it or something like that, but it was a very popular novel. He also wrote this other work called Emile, or On Education, which, by the way, was one of the first works written, like a type of education treatise, which discussed the idea of having a public educational system, like in like a state or whatever, kind of popularized that idea, or secularized type education. So he was kind of ahead of his time on writing about that. He also had had an autobiography he wrote that was later called The Confessions of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. That wasn't published till later, but it was considered to be one of the first major autobiographies that was first written around the 18th century, and it kind of popularized the idea of an autobiography overall. Let me talk about one more famous figure. It was kind of big too in the Enlightenment, which was Adam Smith. I usually kind of mention about him as well. Smith was Scottish. He was this economist and philosopher that went to the University of Glasgow, and he was, I think, a professor there as well. And he was kind of important in popularizing the idea of what we call free trade. He's kind of considered like an early father of what we call capitalism, which eventually will replace mercantilism, which was at the time the popular form of economics that most states were kind of had at the time, like France, Britain, etc. And they believe that Smith was influenced by these group of French economists that were called physiocrats. And physiocrats were these economists that I think that went back to, I want to say all the way back to Colbert's time, under Louis XIV, and all that. They tried to push around this idea of free trade between nations, also laissez-faire economics, where a government wouldn't like over-regulate like their economy, so there'd be less restrictions. So economy could free flow easily, and so they think the physiocrats, they believe that basically the wealth of nations is derived, you can see, from agriculture, the kind of products they produce, the commodities, and then also all the natural resources of a nation that they have, like coal or whatever minerals that they have. They think those should be put on a higher value, oil or whatever, I guess. And so, the term laissez-faire, is a term they start kind of pushing around at that time, which the word means in French, let do or leave alone. It's the idea of this. And that's part of an idea that they do kind of push early on, especially in like early classical free market economic theory. Something they're kind of real popular. So Smith later, influenced by, the French physiocrats and all that, later went on to publish his famous magnum opus, which was, of course, The Wealth of Nations, which came out in 1776. And that particular book was important because it laid the foundations of really early ideas of free trade and early capitalism. That's why it's such a big work of importance. And some of his ideas were kind of famous. I guess the most famous thing that's now today is that he did talk about this idea of this so-called natural laws of economics that he thought that kind of influenced capitalism or free trade the most. These you've heard of before, which are, of course, are well known. I think everybody's heard of this before, but basically these are the three natural laws of economics: the law of self-interest and the fact that people are working for their own benefit, to make money. That's why people have a business in the end. Make products is to make money. That's why we're in capitalism, whatever. Of course, right there. So that's law of self-interest. Actually, it should be law of competition should be the second law. That's usually the order of it, actually. Competition forces people to make better products. So that's kind of important. So that's going to force companies, corporations, people like me to make a better video, I guess, on YouTube or whatever, to get more people to look at it, right? Whatever. But anyway, so that's that. Law of supply and demand, of course, is the one that's really more famous, I think, than anything. Of course, the idea is that the amount of goods produced affects the market economy. So it obviously dictates prices. So that's kind of why we've got so much inflation, because like there's not enough of a product out there. Like there's not enough beef, or there's a shortage of beef. And so, steak is $25 a pound, right? And things like that. That's all, of course, supply and demand and things like that that are there. So those are ideas that, that obviously that Adam Smith was onto at that point, that really affects later what we call early capitalism. And of course, there's other economists out there that are, influenced. Of course, Karl Marx, later, of course, has a big influence on a lot of economic ideas also as well. I got a few minutes left here. I can also talk about, kind of go through some other, these are kind of famous people too, that were big in the Enlightenment as well, that I didn't really kind of go into detail about. There's some right there, like Pierre Bayle was a famous, really a Dutch scholar who lived in the 17th century. He was well known for his historical and critical dictionary, which they consider actually be one of the first encyclopedias, but it's really more a biography series is what it really was. He also had this thing called the News from the Republic of Letters, because that was one of the things that they call a lot of the philosophers. They often called them the Republic of Letters, because they were writing all over Europe, like to each other, across boundaries and things like that. But it was considered one of the first critical reviews that published against, like, books that they're coming out at the time, which is kind of current they do today also as well. Benjamin Franklin, you've heard of him. He's a famous figure in the Enlightenment, along with Thomas Jefferson, who President of the United States, wrote the Declaration of Independence. You may have heard of him. He was, of course, one of the founding fathers of the United States as well. Our first postmaster general, which is true about that. But you ever heard of Poor Richard's Almanac? That's something he, of course, developed, which is kind of important for like farmers and things like that. That was something he developed that was there. Edward Gibbon, you see there, the top in the middle. He was actually this historian of the British English who became very famous for writing The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which, by the way, was a very popular book around the 18th century when it came out. So he kind of popularized the idea that the Roman Empire declined for various reasons and things like that. You've heard of Goethe. You probably heard of Johann Goethe. He's very, very famous. He was a very famous German novelist, playwright, very famous for the play Faust, which you may have heard of, which was in 2 parts. He had this also very popular novel, though, that was real big in the 18th century, known as The Sorrows of Young Werther. And you've heard of that novel. They say like novels like that, they think, influenced the beginning of Romanticism later, because they think Goethe was the father of Romanticism movement later. And you know the story about the guy. The guy had fallen in love with this woman, but she married somebody else, and so he shot himself. You know about the story about that. And supposedly Napoleon had read it several times. Loved the book, they think. Thomas Hobbes, we talked about him, but he was a famous English philosopher who wrote the book Leviathan in the 17th century, I think 1651. And that book actually popularized the idea of the social contract theory, which was later used, of course, by others like Rousseau. But he also popularized the idea of absolutism and other countries like France and all that, having a very powerful monarch and things like that. Robert Hooke on the bottom left there, you can see he was a scientist in England who was, by the way, a rival to Sir Isaac Newton. The two actually didn't like each other, kind of hated each other. But Hooke was kind of instrumental in developing a lot of the theories on biological cell theory, you know, about that you know, organisms have cells and things like that. But he also popularized the use of microscopes. He had this work called Micrographia that was published around that same time, I guess the time of when Newton's around, and that was a very popular book as well. David Hume also was a Scottish philosopher. He was kind of well known. He kind of knew, I think, Locke, kind of around the same time as John Locke and all those kind of famous philosophers in Britain. He had a famous philosophical work called A Treatise of Human Nature that was well known. Immanuel Kant, of course, very famous German philosopher. He was well known for his work, Critique of Pure Reason. They say Kant was one of the most influential philosophers in the 20th, in that time period, around the like 18th century, I believe it is. But anyway, Kant though, I think him and Descartes probably considered some of the early influential philosophers that later influenced people overall. I did include Moses Mendelssohn. Most people don't know about him, but Mendelssohn was this Jewish scholar that started what they called the Jewish Enlightenment, which was called by the Jews the Haskalah. They think he's kind of important because he helped to kind of emancipate the Jews in Europe, who started to kind of want more freedoms, more rights, to go to university, things like that. And so Mendelssohn was very influential around the 18th century and really influencing that. I did kind of throw one more in I thought I would throw, which would be Thomas Paine. You may have heard of him, who was this philosopher that came to America when they were having the American Revolution. He wrote a book, a pamphlet that was called The Common Sense, as you know. And it actually influenced the Americans to eventually declare independence, you know, from the British. Jefferson wrote, you know, after that, the Declaration of Independence and all that. But there's like numerous figures in the Enlightenment. I didn't talk about all of them. It's just too much, I guess, to really talk about more than general. But there's a lot of people that influenced, of course, a lot of new ideas. And a lot of these ideas go into influence modern Europe, but also the world, you know, in general, you know, especially over time. So it doesn't look like I have any comments, questions like today, but I didn't get to say hi to Courtney. Courtney, up here having a great morning. Looks like Kayla also joined us as well this morning. So I forgot to mention y'all out there as well. So that's pretty much my lecture, of course, on the scientific revolution, of course, in the age of enlightenment. Next week, I'm going to be moving on to talk about the French Revolution, like that period in the age of Napoleon. So we'll get into that next. Talk about how all of these ideas kind of launch, you know, the French Revolution. I'll spend maybe a little time talking about the American Revolution. I don't usually go as much into that because we're not really an American history type class, but I'll talk about that a little bit as well, along with, you know, Napoleon. So that's it for pretty much the week. As I said before, I did have, you know, reminders out there about assignments. You know, I did put up that new quiz on the rise of the British Empire. But don't forget, the first exam, I think, is going to close today on absolutism. So make sure you wrap that up overall. And then, of course, vocab is due Friday. So make sure you start uploading that assignment to me of course, in Canvas and all that. So that's it for today. Hope you'll have a good weekend coming up. And of course, I'll see you, next week and all that. So y'all take care.